make up. Oh. Well, I can just call on him.
You never called on Taylor. I kept pointing at her last time.
Oh, she was on vacation. She was.
No, she wasn't. Her spring break gave for 2 weeks.
I think you were just jealous. She had 2 weeks.
Just because you don't call on her.
Uh,
Yeah, I'm your favorite still.
all right. Everybody have a good weekend so far? Everybody spend all the time they could outside yesterday? The nice cold. That was a big change from middle of last week and a big change to tomorrow. It's just, this has been a weird winter. Tell you what, everybody, Ron and Kathy must be praying hard against me for good weather, and I'm praying for bad weather.
You all get on the same page anytime soon.
It's going up and down.
I did not like that sleet.
Yeah, it was weird. But it had some big flakes though, of snow. That was neat to see. All right, we are in Acts chapter 1, 3. We spent some time talking about the qualifications of an apostle, and noticing the fact that as they're getting ready to pick another one, that they had to choose a man that fit those qualifications. It had to be one that was a witness of Christ in his life, and that was the beginning of his ministry, from his baptism through the resurrection. And it was important because, as Jesus stated, they were going. He stated that audio just went out. Oh, it's back. It turned red on me. Holly's texting me. Audio's down. Anyways, no, it's back. It's turned red on me. I don't know why. But so, anyways, we're looking at Paul and the fact that he's a chosen apostle, a called apostle. He obviously had to deal with people not believing he was an apostle. But we looked at evidences, and I think the strongest evidence is the ability of Paul to pass the spiritual gifts on. And that proves and shows that he is an apostle, even though he stated it many times. All right, so then we get down to verse 23. Somebody read 23 through 26, please.
And they appointed Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was surnamed Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, Thou, Lord, which knowest the hearts of all men, show whether of these two thou hast chosen, that he may take part of this ministry and apostleship from which Judas by transgression fell, that he might go to his own place. And they gave forth their lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles.
All right, so from this, what Peter had stated, they chose two people out of this, around 120 people that were here. They chose two people to possibly be chosen to be an apostle. It was probably the apostles who chose these two men, knowing who would have been around during the time of the life of Christ and the death of Christ. For the people that were there, they would have known who also was there and had seen, and so they were the ones that probably chosen. Nothing else but what is stated here is known of these men. And that's what's interesting. We know a lot about majority of the apostles, especially Peter and John, and we know a lot about Paul later. We know a lot about the apostles, but when we get to this point, we don't know anything. We don't hear any more about Matthias. We don't hear any more about Barsabbas. And we're not told anything before. So what we know is just right here. And so verse 24 It says, and they prayed and said, you, O Lord, who know the hearts of all, show which of these two you have chosen. And so they prayed to God to make the choice who would be the replacement. Since it says Lord, would they be praying to Jesus here? And we talked about this on Sunday nights, remember? We talked about praying to Jesus. It says here that they prayed and said, oh Lord. Now, a lot of times the word Lord is associated with God the Father and God the Son. And so it's interchangeable throughout the scriptures. And so God chose here, since it says he prayed, obviously because of all the other passages that we've looked at, when praying to the Father, it was to the Father. And so they were praying for his guidance. And so they could have, so the reference to the fall of Judas and his sin that he had committed, and this it's what's stated here. His sin caused him to lose this position of the apostleship and fall to hell. And so it says, verse 25, to take part in the ministry and apostleship in which Judas by transgression fell, that he might go to his own place. And I think that's reference to the fact that the outcome of his decision of what he did, and not repenting of that and not changing. And so the lot fell upon Matthias. Now, what is a lot? That's verse 26. It says, and they cast their lots, and a lot fell on Matthias. And he was numbered with the 11 apostles. What is a lot? And so there's a couple things. Knox is a commentary, very good commentary. He's a member of the church, who wrote on this. He said, what was the lot? It could have been any number of things which were used to determine an answer. A piece of bone, a stone, a piece of broken pottery, etc. One simply does not know how it was done. What is known is that they asked God to show them who was to replace Judas, and that a lot of some kind was used and directed by God to give the answer. And so they would take in a sense, they would take a piece, today we would say a hat, and you would draw names out of a hat. That's what they were doing. Now, the idea of casting lots was something that was done many times in the Old Testament. And so this is not new to them. He continues on, it says this, after this event, the casting of lots to make a decision is not seen in the scriptures again. It's interesting. It's the last time we see this happen. From Luke 1, verse 9, it is learned that the priests were still drawing lots at the temple to determine what task each priest was to do. If you remember back in Luke 1, when it's talking about John the Baptist's father, which is Zacharias, they, as a priest, they were given different tasks. And his lot fell to do some service that was mentioned there in Luke. So that's what it's talking about. And so one might also consider the high priest of the Old Testament, which carried the Urim and Thummim inside his breastplate. These were used to determine a matter which needed to be decided. When he reached inside the pocket of his breastplate and withdrew the object, it was not he who determined the outcome, but God was giving the answer. And so it was believed that what they were doing, which they were commanded to have this Urim and Thummim, I'm going to say that right. God told them to have it and to put it in the breastplate. And so then God had a hand in what the choice that was being made. Now, is that the case today? I don't see where that would be the case today. As we don't see this happening ever again. I don't see that this is something that can happen today. If we're trying to make a decision, we're just going to, cast the 8 ball in a sense. That's not what we need to be doing. But there's some examples. Somebody read Exodus 28 and verse 30. I don't think you guys have these verses, do you? Or do you have these? Exodus 28 and verse 30? Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
And you shall put in the breastplate of judgment, the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the bear the judgment of the children of Israel over his heart before the Lord continually.
All right, so it was commanded that he was to have this by his heart, the breastplate. And so this was used in the judgment of Israel. Leviticus 8 and verse 8.
And he put the breastplate upon him. Also he put in the breastplate the Urim and the Thummim.
Okay, and then Numbers 27, 21.
And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim before the Lord. At his word shall they go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the children of Israel, with him all, even all the congregation.
Okay, and the last one is Deuteronomy 33 and verse 8.
And of Levi he said, Let thy Thummim and thy Urim be with thy Holy One, whom thou didst prove at Massah, and with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah.
All right, so now think about this in the Old Testament. The Levites, they became priests. Why? Why were the Levites the ones that were to be priests?
God set it up that way.
God set it up that way. There was through blood, right? They were not chosen. There was no qualification that said, okay, you have to be this, this, and this to be a priest. They were a people that were a priest. The men were. The women had their responsibilities too, but the men were to be the priests, and that was because of blood. The high priest was chosen through the lineage of Aaron. And then you have kings that were appointed because of blood. And so you see all these things. There was really no qualifications. God appointed prophets, right? God appointed and selected the judges in the book of Judges. And so when we get to the New Testament, this is happening in Acts chapter 1 before the church comes into existence. And I think that is important because this practice, not seen anymore, did not happen in the New Kingdom, which did not come into existence until chapter 2. So we get to the New Testament, and we have elders that are to be chosen. How are they chosen?
Guidelines laid out.
There's qualifications, right? It's not based on blood. It's not based upon God choosing them. They are appointed to that position because of qualifications. And so this practice of, just putting a name in a hat and saying, okay, whichever one is chosen, God had a part in that. I don't see that something that's in the New Kingdom. Everything that a person is to do it's a qualification. They have to fit qualifications to be elders, deacons, things like that. And so this is interesting because the Amish practice this. They still practice this. I found out talking to an Amish man not a while back, they still practice this in selecting of their bishops and elders. They will cast lots. They will put their names in a pot, and they believe that God has chosen that man the same way. And so, this kind of practice is still done today in denominational areas. And so it's just something to think about, and I think it's interesting. We don't see this happen anymore. But now Matthias is chosen, and he is now numbered with the 12. Now this is important because verse 26 really leads into chapter 2. Because when the Bible was, when this letter was written, there was no chapter breaks, okay? And so verse 26, it says, "And they cast their lot, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were with all one accord in one place." And so now we're going to get into chapter 2. And you want to pass these out, please? And that's important because what is the context of who is being talked about here in the end of chapter 1 and verse 26? And it's the apostles. And that's what's important because we were talking about the 11 and now Matthias, the 12. And so when we get into chapter 2, it is still in reference to this group, this 12 people. And so chapter 1 really lays the groundwork for chapter 2 and gives us, the back history, some more information about Christ, his resurrection, getting us ready, everything ready for chapter 2 to come. And so chapter 2 is, I've said before, it's probably one of the most important chapters of the Bible. One of my instructors in school would always say that there was an old saying that an old preacher, you could tell what kind of a preacher he was. If you open up his Bible, it always opened to chapter 2 of Acts, because everything just leads to that. Everything in the Old Testament leads to chapter 2. Everything from chapter 2 is an effect of what happened there. And so everything just comes to here, this point. And it's important. It's important to note that this chapter is the beginning of fulfilling more prophecy. And there's a couple prophecies. Somebody read Isaiah 2 and verse 3. All right, so some people want to say, and denominational doctrine today show that Isaiah 2 is talking about future events for us, but it was future for them. And looking towards the future, what is Mount Zion? What is another name for Mount Zion? What is the city of Zion in a sense? Jerusalem. And so it's talking about Jerusalem, and it says that the word of the Lord will come from Jerusalem. It is speaking of this day. The gospel is going to come from Jerusalem. And the first gospel sermon we see being preached is in Acts chapter 2. So it's a fulfillment of prophecy. Micah 4, verse 1 and 2. Aaron, would you read that? All right, so a lot of figurative in both of these passages, but they refer to Jerusalem. They refer to the importance of Jerusalem. And Jesus had told them in the last chapter, do not leave Jerusalem. Stay here until you're endued with power upon high. And so they are staying here. And if you go back into chapter 1 in our notes, I gave some more references with that you could look at and refers to this fulfillment of prophecy. And so the first verse says, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were with all one accord in one place. And so we're being told what day it is. This is the day of Pentecost. Now, this was one of 3 major feasts that the Jews were commanded to celebrate every year. They would have the Passover that they would celebrate every year in Jerusalem. They would have the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Booths. Now, the Feast of Booths was not always celebrated. We see in the time of, I'm trying to think of what king it was. I had it earlier. It was the young king, Josiah. I think it was in the days of Josiah that they celebrated this feast, and it was stated that it was not seen how great this feast was since the time of Samuel, I think it was. And so this, they didn't always celebrate these feasts like they were supposed to, but the Feast of Weeks, that is the name of the one that we're talking about here. It's the Pentecost. The Pentecost is 50 days after the Passover. Penta means 50. And so it's 50 days past the Passover, which what happened at the Passover? 50 days before. Yeah, in the Old Testament, for the Israelites, yes, as when the angel of death went over, and so it was instituted that they were to partake of the Passover every year to remember of that. But if you go back to Matthew 26, and you look at verse 17, it says, "Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" Okay, so the day of the feast of the unleavened bread is another reference to the Passover, because they were to eat unleavened bread, right? And so here on the night that Jesus was arrested, so think about the events. They're preparing for the Passover, and the Passover was going to be the next, it was coming up in the next 2 days. So this would be Thursday that they are preparing for the Passover. And Jesus is arrested. The next day, he's crucified, which is Friday. And then 3 days later, Jesus resurrected, which was on Sunday. And so the Passover would have been that Saturday. Wouldn't have been? I think so. Yeah, been that Saturday. But anyways, it's 50 days. And so 50 days past the Passover. This is 50 days since Jesus was crucified. And now we have come to this day of Pentecost. And so there's other names for the Pentecost. The Feast of Weeks. Somebody read Exodus 34 and verse 22.
And you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, of the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end.
Okay, so the Feast of Weeks. Another one is Exodus 23 and verse 16. Okay, so it's also called the Feast of Harvest. And then Numbers 28:26.
Also on the day of the first fruits, when you bring a new grain offering to the Lord at your Feast of Weeks, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work.
All right, so the day of the first fruits. And so there's 4 different names. Honestly, this is the first time that we see the word Pentecost being used. And it's in the New Testament. Maybe it's a translation from the Hebrew to the Greek, why they use Pentecost. But this is the first time we see that word. And so it's used in the Old Testament as meaning the Feast of Weeks, Feast of Harvest, the Feast of, or the First Fruits. And so that's just some other names. So as you're going through the Old Testament, you can recognize this feast in different terms. But what is significant is that this is the first day of the week. Now, there was a law governing when this feast was to happen. Somebody read Leviticus 23, 15 through 16. All right, so there was supposed to be 7 Sabbaths. So that's 7 days times 7, which is 49. And then it's supposed to be the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. And so that would be 50 days. And so this would be, the Sabbath would have been on a Saturday, right? Because Sabbath is always on a Saturday. And so we have the Passover and the Sabbath. If I remember right, it was what they call a high Sabbath, because the Passover and Sabbath came together in the same time. I didn't really research that too much. One of my instructors talked about that a lot. There was different types of Sabbaths because of how the Passover hit. And I think that was one of those times they were preparing for the Passover at the same time as the Sabbath, being on a Saturday. And so I think they called it a high Sabbath. And so that's why it was 50 days later from when Jesus was crucified. And so you have this Sabbath, 50 days later is the Pentecost. And it's significant because it tells us what day of the week it is. It is the first day of the week. It would not have been Saturday, it would have been Sunday morning. And why is Sunday morning significant? What are some other things that happen or we're told happen on the first day of the week? Jesus, somebody read Mark 16 and verse 9.
Now, when he rose early on this first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons.
All right, so this is the first day of the week, right? Being Sunday morning. And Jesus was risen on Sunday morning. The church came into existence on the first day of the week. As we're seeing here in Acts chapter 2, this is the first day of the week. Also, somebody read Acts 20 in verse 7. All right, so the first day of the week, we have an example of the of Paul and the Christians that he was with meeting together and worshiping God on the first day of the week. And then Revelation 1 and verse 10. All right, so John is talking about the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day would be a reference to his day of resurrection, the day that he desires for us to worship. And so Sunday is significant. And when we notice that this was the first day of the week, it's also significant because when we go through the rest of this chapter, they have a gospel sermon being preached. Then they were together, fellowshipping and breaking of bread and spending time together. So they were worshiping. The first Christians began to start worshiping God after they became Christians on the first day of the week. And so we see an example of the Lord's Supper happening, and we also see an example of the sermon being preached, the gospel being preached and studying. And so the first day of the week is significant because of things, and I think it's important to recognize that. And so it says the Pentecost. And so we've talked about the Pentecost, we've talked about the day of the week, we've talked about how this chapter is important. Now, notice verse 1, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. This use of the word they is important because there are many believe that the events of verse 1 through 4 happened to the 120 that were gathered in the upper room. So what that means is that the promise that Christ gave the apostles would have also happened to the 120 that were meeting in that room. Okay? It's important to recognize who the they is here. Now, you got to go and look at, you got to talk about English. When we look at English, the word they is a pronoun, right? Okay? So, you have the nearest antecedent, which is the noun of what it's referring to. You know, when we're talking and we're speaking, you know, I could say, you know, Andy did something, and then my next sentence could be, and he also did this. What do you recognize who I'm talking about? Andy, because the nearest antecedent, which is the noun that I used, was Andy, so we understand that. You know, I had to learn this writing papers in school because, you know, I might be talking about something and then I keep using a pronoun and then I get my pronouns mixed up and then I had to change that. So it's important to recognize who is talking about here. So the word they, the nearest noun, the nearest antecedent would be verse 26 of chapter 1. And who is being talked about here? The apostles. Matthias and the 11 apostles, so the 12 apostles. So, verse 1 of chapter 2 through verse 4 refer to the 12 apostles. It does not refer to the 120. To get the 120, you would have to go back several passages all the way back to verse 15 in Acts chapter 1, and how many names are used in between there? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And so it's also important because I have some here. I'm going to read this. This statement says the antecedent of any pronoun is generally found to be referring back to the nearest noun with which it agrees in person, number, and gender. Clinches the argument that the baptism with the Holy Spirit was something that happened only to the apostles as far as Acts 2 is concerned. And so the they could only refer to the apostles, so that means they were the only ones receiving the Spirit here. And notice also, what was the promise? Who was the promise given to in Acts chapter 1? The apostles. So not only do we can recognize the nearest noun is the apostles, but the promise was given to the apostles. So it's not going to change when we get to chapter 2 and be promised to 120 people also. It was just to the apostles. And so that's important because you will find, you know, somebody will say, well, that happened to the 120. It didn't. And so somebody read verse 2 through 4 now.
And suddenly there came a sound from heaven of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as a fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance.
All right, so I have seen pictures of depictions of this day. You probably have too, where you have the apostles and you have these cloven tongues, or these tongues that are above their heads that are of fire. Okay? That is not accurate because, going back to English again, what is a figure of speech? What are some words that show us that we're using figures of speech? Notice two small words used. Verse 2. There came a sound from heaven as. Is as a, what is that? That is a, yeah, it's a, not a simile. If Holly was here, she would tell me. Yeah, it's a simile. And so, as is a simile. And so, it is showing us that it is as a rushing mighty wind. So the sound that they heard was like it was wind. It gave that sound of wind. And so it was the Spirit, in a sense, rushing out of heaven to fall upon them, and it sounded like a wind. Now, it wasn't really wind. Not only that, you get to verse 3, and it says, "Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire." So it wasn't fire, but it was something that looked like fire. Okay? The divided tongues, the idea of divided here, or cloven tongues, means it was several of them. They were all above, they appeared above the apostles. Something on the side note, this is one way to show who the apostles were to others, wasn't it? Because if it wasn't above their head when the people are viewing this, then they weren't an apostle. And so, that's just something interesting. But anyway, Knox said this: the writer believes the picture, which should be seen, is a light which appeared and divided itself into 12 distinctive lights, each shaped like a tongue. These 12 lights then settled on the heads of the 12 apostles. And so this is his picture in his mind of what he has seen. It's not really tongues. It was something that was similar, looked like a tongue, but it was a light that was very bright, that settled above their heads, and it just showed what was happening to them, that the Spirit was coming upon them. And so they, the apostles, were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues. Now, the word tongues, it means languages. They were able to speak in other languages. They were speaking in languages that they did not already speak. Now, someone today could, in a sense, speak in languages, but they have to learn them, right? You have to learn other languages. They were miraculously able to, at that point, speak in all these different languages. It was something miraculous. The Spirit gave them that utterance. And so they were at this point. Now, something I didn't think about until I was studying this more is, were they given all the miraculous abilities at this point? I've always, not always, but I've thought about that. I thought, okay, well, this is the point where the Spirit fell upon them. They were able to perform miracles and do all these things. But somebody read Matthew 10, verse 7 through 8.
And as ye go preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils. Freely ye have received, freely give.
This is way back during Jesus' ministry. This would be what we would call the first commission. It was them to go and preach the baptism of John, the baptism of repentance, to Israel. What were they able to do then? Miracles. So they already were able to perform miracles. They were already healing people. They were already doing these miraculous abilities. The only thing that they did not have was what was given to them at this point. And what that was they were given the ability to remember what they were told. Remember, Jesus said, I will send the Comforter to help you remember the things which I've told you. So they were given the ability to remember what they were told and then be able to communicate that message to anyone of any language. That's what they were given at this point. They already were able to perform miracles. They just didn't have the knowledge of the church yet. They didn't have the connecting dots of what the church and the kingdom was until this point. And once they had that, then Peter stands up the rest of the chapter and preaches the gospel sermon. And so we see that they were given this ability here. in Acts chapter 1, and it's important to recognize that it was just the apostles that were given this ability. So we're out of time. Anybody got any questions? I'm not going to be here next Sunday, and so there'll be another class, but we will pick up following week in the rest of chapter 2. Thank you guys for your time.